was recently visiting an old friend of mine after several years, catching up on all that had happened with each other and in the world. And as we chatted, we shared a cup of tea, something we always did when we roomed together in college. Our afternoon tea time was sacred time, where we had deep conversations about our philosophy of life and world affairs. And here we were once again on our second cup of tea and in yet another deep conversation. And there was a moment where we both paused and said, "Oh my gosh, this feels so wonderful." This wonderful feeling of enjoyment stayed with me for quite some time. And it got me thinking, what was it about our tea conversation that felt so good? I'm sure many of you can relate to that, right? You met up with friends over coffee or drink or meal. Such meetings can no longer be taken for granted. Over the past year and a half, as we all know, we have had the most profound experience of knowing what it feels like when it's lonely, isolated, and socially disconnected. We recognize now the deep longing we have for social connection. When we couldn't meet, we got creative. We started Zooming with family and friends. I'm sure many of you can relate to that, you're right? Maybe Zoom fatigue right now. And talked across driveways. We have seen videos of people singing and playing music across balconies. And many of us, including myself, have found comfort on online platforms. So we've always known from the beginning of our existence that we as human beings need social connection. But what is it about social connection what does that do for us physiologically and emotionally? We're learning from neuroscience that it's not just our brain responding. We often think it's just our brain that's picking up cues. But our body sends and receives information without even the brain being involved. And that our body, our nervous system, is picking up cues from the environment on what is safe and what is dangerous without us even being aware of it. Now, we've heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response. But however, there's one more response that is unique to mammals and human beings. And that is, we seek safety in our connections with others. This is based on the work of a scientist, Dr. Stephen Porges, who studied the vagus nerve. It's a nerve that wanders through our body. And he calls this the polyvagal theory. And this vagus nerve starts at the base of our skull, and one part of it comes down to our heart and all the way up to our face. And the other part goes down to our gut and our digestive organs below our diaphragm. So there's one above the diaphragm, the other one's below the diaphragm. Now it's the top part of the vagus nerve, or the ventral vagal, that is cued into connecting with other people. And it detects safety and danger based on the expression of the person's face, the look in their eyes, the sound of their voice. Our nervous systems talk to each other. I bet you didn't know that, right? And that when we find a match, when our nervous systems begin to regulate each other. In other words, we co-regulate. There's chemistry between us because our nervous systems have found a match. There's another concept in which is the nervous system, the fact that it picks up cues from the environment. Dr. Porges calls this the neuroception. So you all may have had this experience of walking into a room, right, and knowing whether it is a friendly, welcoming environment or it's a not friendly at all, right? I can tell that this audience is very friendly. My neuroception is picking that up. Another part of this theory is that we have a predictable hierarchy of responses, which is millions of years old. And it's continued to stay with us through the evolutionary process. And this is important, and I'll tell you that in a few minutes. The bottom, so let's think of it as a ladder, right? The bottom of the ladder is the most primitive form of survival. And that is when we are faced with life-threatening situations, we get immobilized, we freeze, right? Think of a turtle that when it's afraid, it just goes into its shell. And this is where we experience overwhelm, shut down, and depressed. And that is 500 million years old. Next up the ladder is the fight or flight response that came into being 400 million years ago. And that is where we either flee or we fight the predator, right? And this is activating the sympathetic nervous system. And this is where we feel anxious, we feel avoidant, or aggression. And then the next up the ladder came 200 million years ago, and that is the one that's unique to mammals and human beings, and that we seek safety in our social bonds with each other. And that's the place where we feel connected to ourselves and connected to each other. Now, the fact that it's millions of years old is important because it tells us how quickly our body responds to things, how quickly our nervous system responds to things. Now, there's a lot more to this theory, which if you'd like to learn more, Dr. Porges and his colleague Deb Dana have written a lot more about it. So in terms of the ladder, we're often going up and down the ladder, sometimes several times a day. But we usually have a hangout place. So think of where your hangout place might be. And it's important because we need to know what our nervous system is doing. Mine tends to be in the middle of the ladder, the activated place, right? I have to work at going back up the ladder. And every time we're stressed, we go back down the ladder. So all this is to say that our nervous system that has been around for millions of years is working to help us survive. Now you may wonder, what does all this have to do with the tea conversations I mentioned earlier? I grew up in India in a culture that is very steeped in tradition and rituals. And for a long time, I did not like those traditions. I didn't understand what those were about. It's only now that I'm looking at it with new eyes. I recall as a little girl watching my appearance, with the utmost grace, inviting people in for tea, preparing the tea, or the chai as we call it, with their gentle insistence of please come in for a cup of tea, or won't you at least have a cup of tea before you leave? So this simple tradition of sharing tea, which is so nuanced and has come down from generation to generation. But as you can see, it's almost like our nervous systems are in a spa together. So there's one more thing that we pay attention to in our nervous system, and that is body sensations. Body sensations inform us on whether we are shut down, activated, or we are feeling calm and regulated. And we feel calm in many ways. We feel calm through prayer and meditation, perhaps through exercise, taking walks in nature. And being calm is important. Self-regulation is very important. But co-regulation is a necessary component of being on top of the ladder. So think about the practices that you engage in, your cultural, family, personal traditions that help you co-regulate. Some of you may relate to the practices from generation to generation that have come down, and others of you may have created your own. So what traditions and practices do you have? Maybe Sunday meals with family or celebrating holidays? Or a monthly book club? Or spiritual or traditional practices? What have you noticed for yourself? We're learning, for instance, that ancient practices that have come down the generations have always known that we can regulate, know how to regulate or co-regulate with each other. For instance, the ancient practice of folk dancing, where people come together, swaying together, moving rhythmically together, singing, dancing, or singing and drumming together, or finding that place where people can connect even when they're doing different things. For instance, think about being in a church and singing hymns together, or being in the mosque praying the namaz together, or dancing at a powwow, or chanting together. All of these practices help us not only co-regulate, but it helps us to relieve stress from our bodies and regulates and calms our nervous system. And when our nervous system is at rest, we can focus on growth and rejuvenation. And how do we know that? We know that when we are in a place where we feel safe, we feel good, we feel like we belong. So think about the time when you feel that way. It's, I feel so good. Perhaps with seeing your child nestled in your shoulder, or you're cuddling with your pet, or you get a big warm hug from a friend, or you're in a group or a community that completely gets you, those are the places that we can find that can co-regulate. And that's the place I refer to as the place of sweet goodness, the place that nurtures our soul. So think about the practices that you have, and maybe the next time you're at one of these events, take pause, notice, what is your body doing? How is your nervous system feeling? What body sensations do you have? And when you find that place of sweet goodness, see if you can soak that in completely. It's because we need that to counteract the fight, flight, or freeze response. Now we're at a pivotal time in our lives where we can jump back in, business as usual, or we can go back with intention. So look through the practices that you have, that you can connect with. And as you become aware of them, nurture them. If you're at the brink of losing them, reclaim them. If you've lost them, recreate them. And if you see others practicing their traditions, honor them. Because it's in this place where we find that place of sweet goodness, where we feel safe, we belong. That's where we want to take pause. Notice what your body is doing and how it's feeling. Take note of the happy place your nervous system is in. Rest in that place. And then soak it all in. Thank you.